So I did my presentation on chapter 8 of the textbook, which discusses the problems of personal identity and also life after death. So starting with personal identity, Pojman brings up two main questions about what defines personal identity. One is what defines our humanity, what defines our personhood, what makes us a person. So the Judeo-Christian explanation of this talks about how we have our ability to reason, we have our ability to make moral choices, and that's what defines our personhood. And Locke says a similar thing when he says that our personhood is, quote, a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places. So other arguments that answer this question involve the idea that our brains are more developed than animal brains, so that's what makes us a human rather than an animal. So the second question with personal identity is, what is identity? So Hume tries to answer this question by simply stating that the concept of I is just a perception, and that our consciousness is merely a function of our brain. But Pojman talks about the idea of continuity over time, which says that identity is something that changes, but is still in some way the same thing as it was before. So to exemplify this, Thesis talks about a ship, where if you were to take every board in that ship over time and replace it with a new board when it just needs to be replaced or for whatever reason, would this ship that eventually has a completely new set of material still be the same ship as before? And you could further take this example by talking about, well, these planks that we used, that we took off of the original ship, if we built a new ship out of that, which is closer to the original identity? Is it the ship with the new parts, or is it the ship made out of the original parts? So if we combine these two questions, personhood and identity, we get personal identity, which Pojman brings up two criterions that can define personal identity. The first one being psychological state criterion. So this defines personal identity as the continuation of our memories over time. So we do have a couple problems with this criterion. What if you were to lose your memories? Would you cease to be the same person? Would you lose your identity? The philosopher Thomas Reid brings up an example. Say you were 25 and you had a memory of something you did when you were 10, and then later down the road when you're 60 and you forgot that thing when you were 10, are you a different person when you're 60 as opposed to when you're 25? Another problem is, what if two people had a same memory? Would they be a separate identity, or would they be the same? The other criterion is called the body criterion, which means that you have the same body over time, so that's your identity. So one scientific problem with this is the fact that all the cells in your body are replaced around every 7 years. So would that mean that you are a different person every 7 years according to this criterion? Another similar criterion is called the brain criterion, which means you have the same brain over time. Another scientific question to this criterion is the fact that if you were to destroy half of your cerebral cortex, you would still be conscious. So if you were to transplant half of your brain to one person and half to the other person, would you exist as two identities now, or would you be a single identity still, or would you just be dead? So Derek Parfit introduces this idea of proximate identity, which says that over time we retain our identities, though with changes. So part 2 of this chapter talks about the question of whether or not there's life after death. And there are 3 main Western explanations for this question. The first one is called materialist monism, and it states that the soul cannot live outside the body. So when you die, your soul dies with it. The next one is called the Platonic Cartesian view, which states that the soul can exist outside of the body, and it lives on as ourself as after our physical body dies. And the third view is the Hebrew view, which is based off of the Bible, and it says that after death you receive a new glorified body. And it's similar to original body, but it can live on forever. So another idea, another explanation for life after death is the idea of reincarnation, which is promoted among Hinduism and Buddhism mostly, and it states that you will continue to be reborn as a new living being on earth until you reach nirvana, and that will end that cycle. So some questions that can go with this are, well, where does the soul go in between your lives, and why don't babies have the knowledge and wisdom of their former selves when they're reborn? Pojman ends the chapter talking about the studies of James Moody, which he brought together a lot of accounts of people who were declared clinically dead and had an out-of-body experience and then ended up coming back to life and telling these experiences. And they all had very similar experiences, which what would happen is they would feel like they were outside of their body, but they were kind of in a new body, and they would have this being of light that would come and help them reflect upon their past life, and they would come to the barrier between life and death and ultimately decide that they're not finished and that they want to go back to life, so they would go back. So my thoughts on this chapter are that I think those experiences, those out-of-life experiences or out-of-body experiences, really go along with the Hebrew idea of life after death, where you have a new body outside of your death when you die. And I think it also answers the question of, like, where does your soul go after you're, like, before you're put into your glorified body. It would seem, according to those experiences, that you are instantly in a new glorified body. So questions you could ask about that are, if people in these out-of-body experiences were lying, how can we explain how all the experiences were so similar? And then also, could it be that they were hallucinating and they were just reflecting upon what they would have hoped would happen or what their religious beliefs said would happen? On the questions of personal identity, I think the idea of proximate identity combined with the psychological states criterion and the body criterion is the best explanation for identity, but I would also ask, is the question of identity something that we can even prove with logic and reason, or is it something that we just define ourselves?